Kansas frontier, spring of 1892. After a flash flood sickness stole her husband and every dime they owned, Sadie Willow Bennett, 7 months with child faces, an unmerciful prairie night, and a landlord who wants coin she can't pay. Desperate to keep a roof over her unborn babe, Sadie bargains her labor into a crooked work contract that's little more than servitude beneath a leaking barn roof. Enter Rhett, dust, silent Morgan, a drifting cowpuncher who broke from trail life after burying too many partners beneath cedar crosses. One look in Sadie's storm-grey eyes, and his long, quiet conscience roars awake. He strikes a bold deal, pay her back rent, and give her shelter at his half-run-down Circle M spread. But when Sadie's landlord plots to reclaim his property through false debt papers and a hired gun, can a guilt-haunted cowboy and a desperate widow find the strength to protect the new life growing between them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather-bound Bible sat heavy in Sadie's lap, its worn pages yellowed with age and tender handling. Henry's Bible, the one his mother had pressed into his hands when he'd left Illinois for the promise of Kansas land. Now it was all she had left of him, save for the child that stirred restlessly beneath her ribs and the thin gold band that had grown loose on her finger these past hungry weeks. She traced the embossed lettering on the cover, remembering how Henry would read to her in the evenings after their modest supper, his calloused finger following the words he'd learned to sound out in the one-room schoolhouse back home. "The Lord is my shepherd," he'd begin, his voice gentle as spring rain on new wheat. "I shall not want." Want. The word tasted bitter now, here in the cramped room above Ezra Polk's general store, where the roof leaked and the floorboards sagged under the weight of her desperation. She wanted for everything food that would stay down, a bed that didn't smell of mildew, a future that stretched beyond the next meal. Most of all, she wanted Henry back, wanted his steady presence and quiet strength to shield her from the harsh realities of frontier life. The baby kicked, and Sadie pressed her palm to the spot, feeling the small life that had become both her greatest blessing and her deepest burden. 7 months along, and already she could feel the child's restlessness, as if it sensed the uncertainty that surrounded them both. Dr. Henley had warned her about the stress, how it could affect the birthing, but what choice did she have? Ezra Polk's patience had worn thin as winter ice, and his demands grew more unreasonable with each passing day. "Mrs. Bennett." The voice from below made her start. Polk's nasal tone carried up through the thin floorboards, edged with the particular cruelty he reserved for those who owed him money. "Time to earn your keep." Sadie closed the Bible and set it carefully on the rough wooden crate that served as her bedside table. The work contract she'd signed in desperation lay beside it, the ink still dark enough to mock her with its terms. 12 hours of labor daily, in exchange for room and board, though the room was little more than a storage closet, and the board consisted of whatever scraps Polk deemed fit for his charity case. She pulled herself to her feet, one hand braced against the wall, the other supporting her swollen belly. The stairs creaked ominously under her weight, and she moved carefully, mindful of the loose board near the bottom that had nearly sent her tumbling just yesterday. Polk stood waiting in the store's dim interior, his thin frame silhouetted against the morning light that filtered through the grimy windows. "The Miller boy brought word about a delivery coming in this afternoon," he said without preamble. 50-pound sacks of grain. You'll help unload." Sadie's hand tightened on the banister. "Mr. Polk, I don't think—" "You think too much, Mrs. Bennett. That's always been your problem." His pale eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement if it weren't so cold. "Contract says you work. Doesn't say what kind of work, does it?" The contract. Always the contract. She'd signed it in a moment of pure desperation, when the alternative was sleeping in the street with nowhere to go and no money for passage back to Illinois. At least here she had a roof, even if it leaked. At least here she had work, even if it was slowly killing her. "I'll do what I can," she said quietly. "You'll do what you're told." Polk turned away, dismissing her with the casual cruelty of a man who'd never known real hardship. And mind you, don't drop anything. Damaged goods come out of your wages. What wages? The thought burned in her throat, but she swallowed it down. Poke provided room and board, he claimed, and that was payment enough for a woman in her condition. Never mind that the room was a closet and the board was table scraps. Never mind that she worked from dawn to dusk while he sat in his chair, counting his money and planning his next acquisition. The morning passed in a blur of dusting shelves and sorting inventory, tasks that grew more difficult as her belly pressed against the counters and her back ached from the constant bending. By noon, she was exhausted, her feet swollen in her worn boots and her hands cramped from gripping items too tightly, a habit she'd developed to avoid dropping anything and facing Poke's wrath. It was then that she heard the horse outside. The sound of hoofbeats on the dusty street wasn't unusual. This was a frontier town, after all, where horses were as common as tumbleweeds. But something about the measured pace, the deliberate way the rider approached, made her look up from the bolt of calico she was arranging. Through the window, she saw him. He sat his horse like a man who'd been born to the saddle, his frame tall and lean beneath a weathered coat that had seen better days. His hat brim shadowed his face, but she could see the sharp line of his jaw, the way his eyes moved over the street with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to watch for trouble. There was something in his bearing that spoke of distances traveled and hardships endured, a quality that reminded her of the soldiers who'd passed through town during the war. The rider dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the ground with barely a sound. He tied his horse to the post outside the store and stood for a moment, studying the building with those watchful eyes. Then he pushed through the door, the bell overhead chiming his arrival. "Help you?" Poke's voice carried a note of calculation, the tone he used when sizing up a potential customer's purse. "Need supplies," the stranger said. His voice was low, rough-edged, like weathered leather. "Trail rations, ammunition, grain for the horse." "Trail rations, eh? Heading out again soon?" Poke's attempt at friendliness fell flat. "Most folks are settling in for spring planting about now. Most folks aren't me." The simple statement carried weight, and Sadie found herself stealing glances at the stranger as she continued her work. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps 40, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years, squinting into sun and wind. His hands, she noticed, were steady and careful as he examined the goods Poke offered, but there was something in the way he held himself that suggested he was ready for trouble at any moment. "Mrs. Bennett," Poke called suddenly, making her jump. "Fetch down that coffee from the top shelf. Our friend here might be interested." She reached for the ladder, but the stranger's voice stopped her. "Ma'am shouldn't be climbing in her condition." The words were spoken quietly, but they carried an authority that made Poke's eyebrows rise. Sadie felt heat flood her cheeks, embarrassed to have her pregnancy so obviously noted by a stranger, but also touched by the unexpected consideration. "I can manage," she said softly. "I'm sure you can." The stranger's eyes met hers, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. Kindness. When had she last seen simple kindness in a man's eyes? "But you shouldn't have to." He reached up easily, his long arms making short work of retrieving the coffee tin. As he handed it to her, their fingers brushed, and she felt the calluses on his palms, the careful gentleness of his touch. "Thank you," she whispered. "Rhett Morgan," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." "Sadie Bennett." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that went deeper than names or circumstances. She saw in his eyes the same weariness she felt in her bones, the same sense of being adrift in a world that seemed determined to break the unwary. But there was strength there too, a quiet determination that spoke of battles fought and won. "Well, ain't this touching?" Poke's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Mrs. Bennett, you've got work to do. Those grain sacks won't unload themselves." Sadie's face burned with shame. She'd almost forgotten where she was, who she was, a woman with nothing to offer but her labor, bound by a contract that grew more oppressive with each passing day. 50-pound sacks? Rhett's voice was deceptively casual. That's heavy work for a woman in her condition. Mrs. Bennett knew what she was signing up for. Polk replied, his tone growing defensive. Contract work. Honest work. I'm sure it is. Rhett's eyes never left Polk's face, and something in his expression made the store owner shift uncomfortably. Just seems like there might be other kinds of work that'd be more suitable. You got a problem with how I run my business, stranger? The air in the store seemed to thicken, charged with tension that made Sadie's heart race. She'd seen this before, the moment when men decided whether to fight or back down. But there was something different about Rhett Morgan, something that suggested he'd been on the dangerous side of such moments more times than most. No problem, Rhett said finally, his voice level, just making an observation. He completed his purchases in silence, paying with coins that rang true on the counter. As he gathered his supplies, his eyes found Sadie's again, and she saw a question there, offer perhaps, or a promise. But before she could decipher its meaning, he was gone, the door chiming behind him. Through the window, she watched him load his supplies into his saddlebags with methodical precision. He swung into the saddle with the same fluid grace she'd admired before, but instead of riding away, he sat his horse in the street, looking back at the store. Looking back at her. Then he touched his hat brim once more and rode away, leaving only dust and the memory of kindness in his wake. Get back to work. Polk snapped, but his voice lacked its usual authority. And don't get any ideas about that drifter. Men like him don't stick around, and women like you can't afford to be choosy. But as Sadie returned to her tasks, her hand instinctively resting on her belly, she found herself thinking about steady hands and gentle eyes, about the way Rhett Morgan had looked at her, not with pity or calculation, but with simple human respect. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope that kindness might still exist in this hard world. The afternoon brought the promised grain delivery, and with it, the crushing reality of her situation. Despite Rhett's intervention, Polk was determined to prove his point. The 50-pound sacks seemed to weigh twice as much as they should, and by the time the last one was stored in the back room, Sadie was trembling with exhaustion. As evening settled over the town, she climbed the stairs to her small room, every step an effort. The Bible waited on her makeshift table, and she opened it to the passage Henry had loved best, the one about green pastures and still waters. Outside her window, the prairie stretched endlessly under a sky painted with the colors of sunset. Somewhere out there, Rhett Morgan was making camp, continuing his journey to wherever men like him went when they had no place to call home. But for a moment, just a moment, she'd seen something in his eyes that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still room in this world for mercy. Ezra Polk slammed the ledger shut with enough force to rattle the glass jars on his shelves. The sound echoed through the empty store like a gunshot, and upstairs, Sadie pressed her hand to her belly, where the baby had startled at the noise. 15 years I've been building this business, Polk muttered to the shadows. 15 years of giving charity to every sob story that walks through that door. And what do I get for it? Some drifting cowpoke telling me how to treat my help. He'd been stewing on the encounter with Rhett Morgan all afternoon, the stranger's quiet authority gnawing at him like a splinter under the skin. Men like Morgan were trouble the kind who rode into town with their moral certainties and their dangerous competence, thinking they could upset the natural order of things. Well, Ezra Polk hadn't clawed his way up from nothing to let some saddle tramp threaten his livelihood. He pulled a bottle of whiskey from beneath the counter and poured himself a generous measure. The liquor burned his throat, but it also burned away the last of his restraint. Sadie Bennett had been a godsend when she'd first stumbled into his store desperate, alone, and willing to work for nothing more than room and board. She was strong enough to handle the heavy work his previous help had complained about, and grateful enough not to ask questions about the terms of her employment. But now she had ideas. He'd seen it in her eyes today, the way she'd looked at Morgan with something dangerously close to hope. That was the problem with charity. Cases give them an inch of kindness, and they started expecting more. The bell above the door chimed, and Polk looked up to see Jake Winters stepping inside. Even in the dim light of evening, Winters cast an imposing shadow, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that suggested violence was never far from the surface. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, a reputation built on collecting debts that others considered uncollectible. "Ezra." Winters touched the brim of his hat with mock courtesy. "Heard you might have some work for me." "Might." Polk poured another whiskey and slid it across the counter. "Depends on your rates for handling delicate situations." Winters accepted the drink, but didn't touch it. "How delicate?" "Got a woman upstairs, pregnant, been working off a debt, but she's getting ideas above her station. Had a cowpoke come through today, got her thinking she's got options." "What kind of options?" Polk reached beneath the counter and withdrew a sheaf of papers. The top document was Sadie's work contract, but beneath it were other paper-solder ones, with different handwriting and different terms. "Mrs. Bennett thinks she's working off room and board, but turns out her late husband owed me money. Gambling debts from before they were married, with interest compounded over time. Well." He spread the forged documents across the counter with the satisfaction of a man revealing a winning hand. "Turns out she owes me considerably more than a few months of store work can cover." Winters examined the papers with the professional interest of a man who'd seen every variation of human desperation. "These look official enough. What do you need me to do?" "Keep her from getting any more ideas about leaving, and if that cowpoke comes back around, make sure he understands that Mrs. Bennett's obligations are already spoken for." "Understood." Winters folded the papers and tucked them into his coat. "My usual rate applies, half now, half when the job's done." They shook hands across the counter, and Polk felt the familiar satisfaction of a problem being dealt with efficiently. Sadie Bennett would learn that charity had its limits, and that gratitude was expected to last longer than the kindness that inspired it. Upstairs, Sadie had heard the murmur of voices, but couldn't make out the words. Something about the tone troubled her. Polk's voice carried a note of anticipation that set her nerves on edge. She'd heard him use that tone before, when negotiating particularly favorable deals, and she'd learned to associate it with trouble for someone else. She closed the Bible and moved to her small window, peering down at the street below. A man was leaving the store tall and broad, with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he had business to attend to. Something about him made her uneasy, though she couldn't say why. The next morning brought an unwelcome surprise. Polk appeared at the top of the stairs just as Sadie was preparing to come down for her morning duties, his thin face wearing an expression of false sympathy that immediately put her on guard. "Mrs. Bennett, I'm afraid we need to have a conversation about your situation." He produced a folder of papers with the theatrical flourish of a man who enjoyed dramatic revelations. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding about the terms of your employment here." Sadie's heart began to race as Polk spread the documents across her small table, pushing aside her Bible to make room. The papers looked official too, official for her comfort. "What kind of misunderstanding?" "Well, it appears your late husband had some outstanding obligations that I wasn't aware of when we made our original arrangement." Polk's voice carried the oily satisfaction of a snake oil salesman. "Gambling debts, incurred before your marriage, but guaranteed by his signature." The words hit her like a physical blow. Henry, gambling, it seemed impossible. He'd been steady, reliable, careful with money to the point of being miserly. But the papers bore his signature, something that looked like his signature. "I don't understand. Henry never gambled. He wouldn't—" "I'm afraid the evidence suggests otherwise, Mrs. Bennett. And with interest compounded over the past 3 years, the debt has grown considerably." Polk ran his finger down a column of figures that seemed to dance before Sadie's eyes. "By my calculations, you now owe me $750. $750. The sum was staggering, more money than she and Henry had seen in their entire marriage. It might as well have been 7,000. "That's impossible. I don't have that kind of money. I don't have any money." "I understand your distress, Mrs. Bennett. Truly I do. But a debt is a debt, regardless of our personal feelings about it." Polk's voice took on the tone of a man making a generous concession. "However, I'm prepared to be reasonable about the terms of repayment." He produced another document, this one clearly freshly written. An extension of your current work agreement. Instead of room and board, you'll be working to pay down the principal debt. At current rates, I estimate it will take approximately 5 years to clear the obligation. 5 years. Sadie's hand moved instinctively to her belly. Her child would be walking and talking before she could even hope to be free of this place. "This isn't right," she whispered. "Henry would never have gambled. These papers are legal and binding." Polk's voice hardened. "I understand this is difficult to accept, Mrs. Bennett, but facts are facts. Your husband incurred this debt, and as his widow, you're responsible for it. But I never agreed to assume his debts. When we married, Kansas territorial law is quite clear on the matter of spousal obligations." Polk gathered the papers with the efficiency of a man who'd had this conversation before. "Of course, if you feel these documents are fraudulent, you're welcome to seek legal counsel. Though I should mention that legal fees would, naturally, be added to your outstanding balance." The trap closed around her with the inexorable force of a steel jaw. Polk had her cornered, and they both knew it. A pregnant woman with no money, no family, and no resources had little recourse against a man with official-looking papers and the law on his side. "I need time to think about this." "Of course. Take all the time you need," Polk smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'll expect your signature on the new agreement by tomorrow morning. And Mrs. Bennett, I do hope you won't entertain any notions about leaving town until this matter is resolved. That would be inadvisable." After he left, Sadie sank onto her narrow bed, the weight of despair settling over her like a shroud. The papers lay scattered on her table, their official seals and legal language mocking her with their authority. $750, 5 years of servitude, her child born into bondage. She picked up Henry's Bible with trembling hands, seeking comfort in its familiar weight. As she opened it, a pressed flower fell from between the pagesha, wild prairie rose they'd picked on their last ride together before his illness. He'd insisted on preserving it, saying it reminded him of her courage in following him to Kansas. Courage. The word felt hollow now. But as she held the fragile flower, she remembered Henry's voice reading from Psalms. "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning." She'd wept through many nights since his death. Perhaps it was time to start looking for the morning. Outside her window, the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and somewhere beyond her sight, a man named Rhett Morgan was going about his business, unaware that a desperate woman was thinking of his kindness and wondering if mercy still existed in this hard world. The baby stirred within her, and Sadie placed both hands on her belly, feeling the strong movements of new life. Whatever happened, she would protect this child. Whatever it cost her, she would find a way to give her baby a better life than the one Ezra Polk had planned for them both. But first, she needed to understand exactly what she was fighting against. And that meant taking a much closer look at those papers, because something about them didn't feel right. And if there was one thing Henry had taught her, it was to trust her instincts when something seemed too convenient to be true. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street when Rhett Morgan rode back into town. He'd spent 2 days at his spread, trying to focus on the endless repairs the Circle M demanded, but his thoughts kept drifting to storm-grey eyes and a pregnant woman trapped in a situation that gnawed at his conscience like an old wound. He'd seen enough injustice in his 38 years to recognize it when it crossed his path, and Ezra Polk's treatment of Sadie Bennett carried the unmistakable stench of exploitation. The way the storekeeper had dismissed her concerns, the casual cruelty in his voice when he'd insisted she handle heavy work in her condition, it all reminded Rhett of the worst kind of men he'd encountered during his years in uniform. But it was more than simple outrage that brought him back to town. Something about Sadie Bennett herself had lodged in his memory like a thorn. The quiet dignity with which she'd endured Polk's treatment, the way she'd moved with careful grace despite her advanced pregnancy, the momentary spark of hope he'd seen in her eyes when he'd shown her simple courtesy, of it spoke to a strength that deserved better than the hand fate had dealt her. Rhett tied his horse outside the general store and stood for a moment, studying the building with the tactical eye that had served him well during the war. The upper windows were grimy with neglect, and he could see a damp stain spreading down one wall where the roof clearly leaked. Not much of a refuge for a woman preparing to bring new life into the world. The bell above the door announced his entrance, and Polk looked up from his ledger with an expression that was equal parts surprise and irritation. "Mr. Morgan, didn't expect to see you back so soon. Need a few more supplies." Rhett's voice was deliberately casual as his eyes swept the store interior. "Maybe some coffee, if you've got any that's fresh." "Coffee's right where it was 2 days ago." Polk's tone carried a note of challenge. "Mrs. Bennett can fetch it down for you, if she's not too busy with her other duties." As if summoned by his words, Sadie appeared from the back room, moving slowly under the weight of a wooden crate that was clearly too heavy for her to be carrying. Rhett was across the store in 3 quick strides, his hands gently taking the burden from her before she could protest. "Ma'am," he set the crate down with careful precision, "that's too much weight for someone in your condition." "I can manage," she said softly, but he caught the grateful look in her eyes. "I'm sure you can manage a lot of things," Rhett replied, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Question is whether you should have to." Behind them, Polk cleared his throat with obvious irritation. "Mrs. Bennett has a contract to fulfill, Mr. Morgan, work that needs doing. Contracts can be renegotiated." Rhett turned to face the storekeeper, and something in his bearing made Polk take an unconscious step backward, especially when the terms seem unreasonable. The terms were agreed upon by both parties. Polk's voice rose slightly, betraying his nervousness. Mrs. Bennett understood what she was signing. Did she? Rhett's eyes found Sadie's again, noting the way her hand had moved protectively to her belly. "Because from where I stand, it looks like she's getting the short end of the bargain." Sadie glanced between the two men, sensing the tension that crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. Part of her wanted to speak up, to explain that she'd had no choice but to accept Polk's terms, but another part warned her to stay silent. She'd learned that men's arguments rarely ended well for the women caught between them. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "I should get back to my work." "No need to rush off, ma'am." Rhett's voice gentled when he addressed her. "I was hoping you might help me with something. I've got a ranch about 5 miles out of town, the Circle M. Been trying to get it back in working order, but I could use some advice about setting up a proper kitchen." The offer hung in the air between them, weighted with possibilities neither of them dared to voice directly. Sadie felt her heart begin to race, not from exertion but from something that might have been hope. "Mrs. Bennett's obligations are here," Polk interjected sharply. "Her contract." "Her contract," Rhett interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to command, "doesn't extend to every hour of every day, does it? Surely she's entitled to some time away from her duties." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch, the coins inside chinking softly as he set it on the counter. "Maybe I could hire her services for an afternoon. Pay a consulting fee for her expertise." Polk's eyes fixed on the pouch with predatory interest. Rhett had counted on that men like Polk could rarely resist the lure of easy money, especially when it came with no effort on their part. "Well," Polk said slowly, "I suppose I could spare her for a few hours, provided the compensation is adequate." "I think you'll find it more than adequate." Rhett's smile was sharp-edged. "For a lady's time and expertise." The transaction was completed with a handshake that felt more like a treaty than a business arrangement. Sadie found herself caught between amazement and disbelief as Rhett helped her into the wagon he'd brought for the purpose, his hands steady and respectful as he assisted her onto the seat. "You didn't have to do this," she said as they rolled out of town, the prairie stretching endlessly around them. "Figured you could use some air that didn't smell like Polk's greed." Rhett kept his eyes on the road ahead, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Besides, I wasn't lying about needing help with the kitchen setup." The Circle M ranch lay nestled in a shallow valley where a creek wound through cottonwood trees, their new leaves bright green against the vast Kansas sky. The house was modest but solidly built, with a wide porch that spoke of evenings spent watching sunsets and listening to the night sounds of the prairie. "It's beautiful," Sadie said softly, and meant it. "It's got potential." Rhett helped her down from the wagon with the same careful courtesy he'd shown in town. Previous owner let it run down some, but the bones are good. He led her inside, and Sadie was struck by the contrast between this simple, honest space and the cramped room above Polk's store. The kitchen was indeed in need of work. The stove was old but serviceable, and the cabinets wanted organizing, but it felt like a real home, not a prison disguised as charity. "What do you think?" Rhett asked, genuine interest in his voice. "I think," Sadie said carefully, "that it could be wonderful with the right attention." They spent the afternoon in companionable work, Sadie advising on the most practical arrangements, while Rhett moved furniture and reorganized storage with patient attention to her suggestions. As they worked, they talked tentatively at first, then with growing ease. "You mentioned you'd been on the trail," Sadie said, as she sorted through a box of kitchen implements. "What brought you to settling down?" Rhett was quiet for a long moment, his hands stilling on the drawer he was adjusting. "Got tired of moving, I guess. Trail life's hard on a man, especially when he's seen too much of what people can do to each other." There was something in his voice that spoke of deeper wounds, but Sadie didn't press. She understood the weight of secrets too well to pry into his. "What about you?" he asked gently. "How'd you end up in Kansas?" "Henry, me husband, he had dreams of farming his own land. Said Kansas was the place where a man could make something of himself if he was willing to work for it." Her hand moved unconsciously to her belly. "He was a good man, a dreamer maybe, but good. I'm sorry for your loss." The simple words, spoken with genuine sympathy, nearly undid her composure. She'd grown so accustomed to Polk's casual cruelty that she'd almost forgotten what kindness sounded like. "He would have loved this place," she said, looking around the kitchen that was slowly taking shape under their combined efforts. "He always said a kitchen was the heart of a home." "He sounds like a wise man." As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Rhett gathered some wooden scraps from a box in the corner. "Cedar pieces," Sadie noticed, sweet-smelling and golden in the lamplight. "What are those for?" she asked. "Oh, just a project I've been thinking about." His voice was casual, but she caught something carefully controlled in his expression. "Figured it might be useful to have around eventually." He walked her to the wagon as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, his hands gentle as he helped her onto the seat. The ride back to town was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts about the afternoon they'd shared and what it might mean. "Thank you," Sadie said as they reached the store. "For the afternoon, for the kindness. I haven't felt so human in a long time." "Mrs. Bennett," Rhett said, and his voice carried a weight that made her look directly into his eyes. "If you ever need anything at all, the Circle M isn't that far away." The promise hung between them as he helped her down from the wagon, and for a moment their hands lingered together longer than strictly necessary. Then the spell was broken by the sound of the store door opening, Polk's voice cutting through the evening air. "Mrs. Bennett, I trust your consultation was productive." "Very productive," Rhett replied evenly. "The lady has excellent advice to offer." As Sadie climbed the stairs to her cramped room, the forged debt papers still waiting on her table, she carried with her the memory of a kitchen that felt like home and the knowledge that somewhere in this hard world, a man was gathering cedar scraps for a project he wouldn't name. For the first time in months, she fell asleep without tears. 3 days later, Rhett returned to town with a proposal that made Ezra Polk's eyes light up with avarice and Sadie's heart flutter with dangerous hope. "I'd like to hire Mrs. Bennett's services on a more regular basis," he announced, placing a substantial sum on the counter. "Say 3 afternoons a week. I'm planning some improvements to the ranch, and I could use a woman's perspective on making the place more livable." Polk counted the money twice, his thin fingers caressing each coin as if it were precious metal. "Well, I suppose we could arrange something. Provided Mrs. Bennett's primary obligations here are met, of course." "Of course." Rhett's voice was perfectly reasonable, but Sadie caught the steel beneath the courtesy. Wouldn't want to interfere with any legitimate work arrangements. And so began the strangest chapter of Sadie's difficult life. 3 times a week, Rhett would arrive with his wagon and collect her for afternoons at the Circle M, paying Polk handsomely for the privilege while treating Sadie with a respect she'd almost forgotten existed. What started as consultations about kitchen arrangements gradually expanded into longer conversations as they worked together to make the ranch house feel like a home. It was during their 2nd week of this arrangement that Rhett showed her the silver locket. They'd been sitting on the porch after a day of organizing the pantry, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. Rhett had been unusually quiet, his weathered hands turning something over and over in his fingers. Finally, he held it out to her. "This belonged to my sister," he said quietly. "Mary. She was about your age when she died." The locket was tarnished with age but beautiful, engraved with delicate flowers around the edges. Inside was a photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, her dark hair pinned in the fashion of a decade past. "She was lovely," Sadie said softly. "She was with child when she died." Rhett's voice was steady, but she could hear the old pain beneath the calm surface. "Her husband was a good man, but he was away working the railroad when her time came. I was supposed to look after her, supposed to make sure she was safe." "What happened?" "Complications during the birth. The doctor said there was nothing anyone could have done, but—" He took the locket back, closing it with careful precision. "I promised my mother I'd take care of Mary. Failed at that, just like I failed at most everything else that mattered." Sadie was quiet for a long moment, understanding now the source of the careful protectiveness she'd sensed in him from their first meeting. "You can't blame yourself for something beyond your control." "Can't I?" Rhett's smile was bitter. "I was good at a lot of things, Mrs. Bennett. Good at following orders, good at staying alive when other men didn't, good at fighting wars that needed fighting. But when it came to protecting the people who mattered most, I was found wanting." "Where was her husband? You said he was working the railroad." "Dead by then. Track accident 3 months before the baby was due. Mary refused to leave the homestead, said it was all she had left of him." Rhett stared out at the darkening prairie. "I should have insisted she come stay with family in town, should have made her see reason. She was grown woman, making her own choices." Sadie's voice was gentle but firm. "You can't carry responsibility for every tragedy that touches your life." "Maybe not, but I can try to do better when the chance comes again." The weight of his words settled between them, and Sadie felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that what was growing between them was more than simple kindness or practical arrangement. Rhett Morgan was a man carrying old wounds, just as she was a woman trying to heal from fresh ones. "Would you like to hear about Henry?" she asked suddenly. Rhett nodded, and in the gathering twilight, she told him about her husband's gentle nature, his dreams of farming their own land, the way he would read to her from his mother's Bible in the evenings. She found herself sharing memories she'd held close since his death, letting them out into the prairie air where they could breathe again. "He sounds like he was a good man," Rhett said when she finished. "He was, but he was also trusting to a fault." Sadie's voice carried a note of frustration. "Those papers Polk showed Meath's supposed gambling debts. Henry would never have gambled away money we couldn't afford to lose. He was careful with every penny, sometimes to the point where I wished he'd be a little more free with his spending." "You don't believe the debts are real?" "I know they're not real, but knowing and proving are 2 different things." She sighed, her hand moving to rest on her belly where the baby was stirring restlessly. "And even if I could prove it, what then? I have no money for lawyers, no family to support me, nowhere else to go. What if you did?" The quietly spoken question hung in the evening air like a promise half-formed. Sadie looked at Rhett, seeing in his profile the same careful control she'd noticed that first day in Polk's store. "What do you mean? What if you had somewhere else to go? Someone willing to help you start over, away from Polk and his schemes?" Her heart began to race, not from exertion, but from the dangerous stirring of hope. "I couldn't ask." "You're not asking, I'm offering." Rhett turned to face her fully, his eyes serious in the fading light. The Circle M has plenty of room. You could have your own space, your own independence, in exchange for whatever help you felt comfortable providing with the house, the cooking, a fair arrangement between equals. People would talk. People always talk. Question is whether you care more about their opinions or your own future. It was a fair point, but Sadie had learned to be wary of offers that seemed too good to be true. Why would you do this? You barely know me. Rhett was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently turning Mary's locket over in his hands. Maybe because I see in you the same strength Mary had, the same determination to make the best of whatever hand life deals you, and maybe because I failed to protect her when she needed it most. I'm not your sister. No, you're not. But you're a woman who deserves better than what Poke's offering, and you're carrying a child who deserves to be born into something better than servitude. His voice carried a conviction that made her chest tight with emotion. I can't change what happened to Mary, but maybe I can do right by you. The baby kicked strongly, as if responding to the tension in her voice, and Sadie pressed her hand to the spot. 8 months along now, and every day brought her closer to the moment when she would hold her child in her arms. What kind of life could she offer that child as Poke's indentured servant? What kind of future lay in working off a debt that would take years to clear, assuming Poke didn't find ways to extend it indefinitely? I need to think about it, she said finally. Of course you do. It's not a decision to make lightly. Rhett stood and offered her his arm. But don't take too long. That baby's not going to wait much longer, and Poke's getting more possessive by the day. The ride back to town was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts about the offer that lay between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. As they pulled up in front of the store, Sadie noticed a horse tied to the poster, large, well-fed animal that spoke of its owner's prosperity. Looks like Poke has company, Rhett observed, his voice carefully neutral. Inside the store, they found Poke deep in conversation with the broad-shouldered man Sadie had glimpsed several days earlier. The stranger looked up as they entered, his eyes moving over Sadie with an assessment that made her skin crawl. "Ah, Mrs. Bennett," Poke's voice carried false warmth. "Perfect timing. I'd like you to meet Mr. Winters. He's here to discuss your situation." Jake Winters touched his hat brim, in a gesture that was polite on the surface but carried an undercurrent of threat. "Ma'am, Mr. Morgan." His voice was gravelly, rough as creek stones. "Heard you folks have been spending a lot of time together lately. Mrs. Bennett has been providing valuable consultation on some improvements to my ranch," Rhett replied evenly. "Is that a problem?" "Depends on whether those consultations are interfering with her other obligations." Winter's smile was cold as winter wind. "See, Mrs. Bennett here has some debts that need settling. Substantial debts, and Mr. Poke wants to make sure she's focused on working them off." "What kind of debts?" Rhett's voice carried a note of steel that made Winter's eyes sharpen with interest. "The kind that don't concern you, stranger." Winters stepped closer, his bulk meant to intimidate. "Mrs. Bennett's affairs are between her and Mr. Poke here. Best if you remember that." The air in the store seemed to thicken with tension, and Sadie found herself caught between two men who looked ready to settle their differences with violence. But it was Rhett who diffused the moment, stepping back with his hands visible and his voice calm. "No argument here, just making sure Mrs. Bennett gets treated fairly." "Oh, she'll get exactly what she deserves," Winters replied, his meaning unmistakable. "Won't you, ma'am?" Sadie nodded mutely, not trusting her voice. As Rhett helped her toward the stairs, she caught his whispered words. "Think about what we discussed. Don't wait too long." Later that night, alone in her cramped room with the forged debt papers mocking her from the table, Sadie held Henry's Bible in her lap and tried to pray for guidance. But all she could think about was the silver locket in Rhett's pocket, the cedar scraps he was collecting for his mysterious project, and the offer of a new life that seemed too good to be true. Outside her window, the prairie stretched endlessly under a star-filled sky, and somewhere in that vastness, a man was preparing to risk everything to give her and her unborn child a chance at freedom. The question was whether she had the courage to take it. The half-finished cradle sat in Rhett's workshop like a promise waiting to be kept. He'd been working on it in the quiet hours after Sadie's visits, his hands moving over the smooth cedar boards with a reverence usually reserved for prayer. Each joint was fitted with meticulous care, each surface sanded until it felt like silk beneath his calloused fingers. It had been 2 weeks since he'd made his offer, 2 weeks of watching Sadie grow more tired and more obviously pregnant with each passing day. Her movements had become careful, deliberate, the easy grace he'd first admired now tempered by the weight she carried. The baby would come soon, any fool could see that, and still she hesitated to accept his help. He understood her caution. A woman alone learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too generous, especially from men she barely knew. But understanding didn't make it easier to watch her struggle under Polk's increasingly unreasonable demands, or to see the way Jake Winters had taken to loitering around the store with the casual menace of a predator marking territory. Rhett ran his thumb along the cradle's rail, feeling for any roughness that might scratch tender skin. Along the headboard, he'd begun carving a verse from Psalms. "He shall cover thee with his feathers, and under his wings shalt thou trust." The words felt appropriate for a child who would need all the protection this harsh world could offer. "That's beautiful work." He turned to find Sadie standing in the workshop doorway, her hand braced against the frame for support. She'd arrived earlier than usual for their afternoon session, and something in her expression told him this wasn't a social visit. "Didn't hear you come up to the house," he said, setting down his carving tools. "Everything all right?" Polk's getting suspicious about our arrangement. This morning he suggested that 3 afternoons a week might be too generous. She moved carefully into the workshop, her eyes fixed on the cradle. "Is this what you've been working on with those cedar scraps? Seemed like it might be useful to have around." Rhett's voice was deliberately casual, but he watched her face for any sign of distress. Baby furniture's always in demand. Sadie approached the cradle slowly, her fingers trailing over the smooth wood, with something approaching wonder. "The carving is exquisite. Where did you learn to work wood like this?" "My father was a carpenter back in Missouri. Taught me the basics before the war, took me away from such peaceful pursuits." Rhett's hands moved over the cradle's side, checking the smoothness of a joint. "Always found it calming, working with wood. Something about taking raw timber and shaping it into something useful, something that might last. The verse you're carving, 'He shall cover thee with his feathers,' that's from Psalm 91. You know your scripture. Henry read to me every evening. That particular passage was one of his favorites. Her voice carried a note of sadness, but also something else, warmth that made Rhett's chest tighten. He said it reminded him that even in a hard world, there was always shelter to be found, if you knew where to look. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both contemplating the half-finished cradle and the hopes it represented. Finally, Sadie spoke again, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. "I've been thinking about your offer. And I'm afraid." The admission seemed to cost her something. "Afraid of what it might mean, afraid of what people will say, afraid of trusting again, when trust has been so costly." Rhett set down his tools and turned to face her fully. "Fear's a reasonable response to uncertainty, but sometimes the greater risk is in staying where you are." "Is it?" Sadie's hand moved to her belly, where the baby was clearly active. "At least with Polk, I know what to expect. Unpleasant as it is, it's familiar. Your offer is kind, but kindness can disappear as quickly as it arrives. You think I'm the kind of man who changes his mind when things get difficult. I don't know what kind of man you are." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, and she immediately looked stricken. "I'm sorry. That was unfair." "No, it wasn't. It was honest." Rhett leaned against his workbench, considering his words carefully. "You're right to be cautious. You don't know me well enough to trust me with your future, or your child's future." He was quiet for a moment, then reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a folded paper. "This might help you understand who you'd be dealing with." Sadie took the document with trembling fingers. Unfolding it, to reveal official military letterhead and formal language that praised Second Lieutenant Rhett Morgan for extraordinary courage under fire and selfless dedication to the protection of civilian populations. The commendation was signed by a colonel she'd never heard of, but the weight of its authority was unmistakable. "You were an officer for a time, during the worst of the fighting down in Arkansas." Rhett's voice was matter-of-fact, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Got the commission because I was good at keeping my men alive and completing missions that others couldn't handle." "What kind of missions?" "The kind that don't get talked about in polite company." He took the letter back, folding it with the same careful precision she'd noticed in all his movements. "Point is, I understand duty. I understand what it means to give your word and keep it, no matter the cost." Sadie was quiet, absorbing this new information about the man who'd shown her such unexpected kindness. "Why did you leave the army?" "Same reason I stopped moving from town to town. Got tired of fighting other people's battles." Rhett's eyes found hers, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch. "But some battles are worth fighting, Mrs. Bennett. Some people are worth protecting." The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick, and Sadie gasped, her hand flying to the spot. Rhett was beside her in an instant, his arm supporting her as she steadied herself. "You all right?" "Just active today." She managed a weak smile. "I think the little one's getting impatient to make an appearance." "How much longer does the doctor think?" "Dr. Henley says any time now. Maybe 2 weeks, maybe less." Her voice carried a note of anxiety that made Rhett's protective instincts flare. "I've been having some pains, but he says they're just practice contractions." "What does Poke expect you to do when the baby comes?" "Work." The single word was bitter. "He's made it clear that my obligations don't end with childbirth. I'll be expected back to my duties as soon as I'm able to stand." Rhett's jaw tightened, and for a moment she glimpsed the dangerous man beneath his careful courtesy. "That's not reasonable." "Reasonable isn't a word that applies to my situation." Sadie moved carefully toward the workshop door, suddenly feeling the need for fresh air. "But I'm grateful for these afternoons, truly. They've given me something to look forward to, a reminder that kindness still exists." "It doesn't have to end there." Rhett followed her outside, where the afternoon sun painted the prairie in shades of gold. "The offer still stands, Mrs. Bennett. A room of your own, independence, a chance to raise your child without the weight of artificial debts hanging over your head. And what would you want in return?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications. Neither of them was quite ready to voice. Rhett was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon where heat shimmers danced above the grassland. "Companionship," he said finally. "Someone to talk to in the evenings, someone who understands that a home is more than just 4 walls and a roof. Help with the cooking when you're able. Maybe some advice on making the place feel less like a bachelor's quarters." "That's all?" "That's all I'm asking for." His voice carried a note of something deeper, something that made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. "What develops beyond that? Well, that would be up to both of us, wouldn't it?" Sadie found herself studying his profile, noting the way the afternoon light caught the silver in his hair, the laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of better times in his past. There was strength in his face, but also gentleness, the combination of qualities she'd once thought she'd found in Henry before illness had stolen him away. "I need to go back," she said suddenly, aware that she'd been staring. "Poke will be expecting me for the evening inventory." "Of course." Rhett helped her into the wagon with his usual careful courtesy. "Mrs. Bennett, Sadie, and know this is a difficult decision, but don't wait too long. That baby's not going to arrive on anyone's schedule but its own." The ride back to town was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts about the conversation they'd shared and the decision that loomed larger with each passing day. As they approached the store, Sadie noticed Jake Winter's horse tied outside once again, and her stomach clenched with anxiety. "He's been coming around more often," she said quietly. "I noticed." Rhett's voice carried a grim note that reminded her of the military commendation in his pocket. "Man like that doesn't usually hang around unless he's expecting trouble, or planning to cause it." "That too." Rhett brought the wagon to a stop and turned to face her. "Promise me something." "What?" "If things get worse, if Polk or Winters try to hurt you or pressure you in ways that cross the line, you'll send word to the Circle M, day or night. It doesn't matter. Promise me." The intensity in his voice, the genuine concern in his eyes, nearly undid her careful composure. "I promise." As she climbed the stairs to her cramped room, Sadie carried with her the image of the half-finished cradle and the man who was carving verses of protection into its rails. For the first time since Henry's death, she allowed herself to imagine a different kind of future one, where her child might grow up free from the weight of artificial obligations, surrounded by the kind of love that built cradles from cedar and carved promises of shelter into every surface. But first, she had to find the courage to claim it. The kiss happened 3 days later, soft as prairie rain and just as unexpected. They'd been working together in Rhett's kitchen, Sadie teaching him to read from the more challenging passages in Henry's Bible while he prepared their simple meal. The afternoon light streaming through the windows cast everything in warm gold, and for a moment it felt almost like the domestic peace she'd once shared with Henry, but different too, charged with an awareness that made her pulse quicken whenever their hands accidentally touched. "Try this verse," she said, pointing to a passage in Ecclesiastes. "Take your time with the longer words." Rhett leaned closer to see the page, his shoulder brushing hers as he began to read haltingly. "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted." His voice grew stronger as he continued, the familiar rhythms of the King James language carrying him forward. "A time to weep, and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones together." He stopped, looking up to find her, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What is it?" "You're reading beautifully." Henry would have been impressed, struggled with some of these passages himself. She smiled, but there was something wistful in her eyes. "It's strange to hear someone else's voice speaking these words. Good strange, but still. I remind you of him." "No." The answer came quickly, surprising them both with its certainty. "No, you don't remind me of Henry at all. He was gentle in a different way, quieter. She searched for the right words. "You're like a storm that's learned to be still." Something shifted in Rhett's expression, and suddenly the space between them felt charged with electricity. Without quite meaning to, he reached up to touch her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with infinite gentleness. "Sadie," he said quietly, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. She should have pulled away. A proper widow, still wearing black for her deceased husband, shouldn't be allowing such intimacies with a man she'd known for barely a month. But the warmth of his touch, the way he looked at her as if she were something precious rather than a burden to be endured, made her forget about propriety. "Rhett," she whispered, and then his lips were on hers, soft and careful, and full of a reverence that made her heart ache with the beauty of it. The kiss lasted only moments, but when they broke apart, something fundamental had changed between them. The careful distance they'd maintained, the polite formality that had characterized their interactions, was gone, replaced by an intimacy that was both thrilling and terrifying. "I shouldn't have," Rhett began, but Sadie silenced him with a finger against his lips. "Don't apologize. Please." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I've felt so dead inside since Henry passed. Like I was just going through the motions of living without really being alive. But when you touch me, when you look at me like that, I remember what it feels like to be a woman instead of just a burden." "You're not a burden." His voice was fierce with conviction. "You're the strongest person I know, and any man would be honored to have your trust. Even carrying another man's child? Especially then." Rhett's hand moved to rest gently on her swollen belly, and she felt the baby respond to his touch with a flutter of movement. "This child is part of you, which makes it precious beyond measure." The tears came then, releasing weeks of pent-up emotion in a flood that left her shaking. Rhett held her carefully, mindful of her condition, his strong arms providing the shelter she'd been searching for since Henry's death. "I'm scared," she admitted against his chest. "Scared of trusting again. Scared of what people will say. Scared of what will happen when the baby comes." "Fear's natural, but you don't have to face it alone." Rhett's voice rumbled in his chest, steady and reassuring. "I meant what I said about the Circle M. There's room here for both of you, for as long as you want to stay." "And if I want to stay forever?" The question hung between them, bold and vulnerable at the same time. Rhett pulled back to look into her eyes, his own dark with emotion. "Then I'd count myself the luckiest man in Kansas." They might have said more, might have made promises that would have changed everything, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the moment. Rhett was instantly alert, his body tensing with the instincts of a man who'd learned to recognize trouble long before it arrived. "Stay inside," he said quietly, moving toward the window. "Might be nothing, but—" Through the glass, they could see Jake Winters riding up the dirt track toward the house, his bulk unmistakable even at a distance. He wasn't alone. 2 other men flanked him, both carrying the kind of casual weaponry that suggested they were more than simple ranch hands. "What does he want?" Sadie asked, fear creeping into her voice. "Nothing good." Rhett's voice was grim as he checked the rifle that hung above the mantel. "But whatever it is, he's not getting it without a fight." Winters dismounted, with theatrical slowness, his companions following suit. When he knocked on the door, the sound echoed through the house, like a death knell. "Morgan!" His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to having his demands met. "Need to have a word with you about Mrs. Bennett here." Rhett opened the door but didn't invite them in, his body blocking the entrance with military precision. "Winters, what brings you all the way out to the Circle M?" "Mrs. Bennett's got some folks worried about her welfare. Missing work, spending time away from town when she's got obligations to meet." Winter's smile was cold as January frost. "Thought maybe you could help us understand what's keeping her so occupied." "Mrs. Bennett is a free woman, last I checked. Free to spend her time however she chooses." "Well, see, that's where you're wrong." Winters produced a folded paper from his coat, the same forged documents Polk had shown Sadie weeks earlier. "According to this legal contract, Mrs. Bennett owes a substantial debt. Now, her creditors getting concerned that all this gallivanting around might be interfering with her ability to work that debt off." "Let me see those papers." Winters handed over the documents with evident satisfaction, watching as Rhett examined them with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to spot forgeries during his military service. The handwriting was good, the seals convincing, but there were subtle inconsistencies that spoke of hasty fabrication. "These look authentic enough," Rhett said finally, his voice giving nothing away. "Course, I'd want a lawyer to verify the signatures before I'd call them legitimate. Lawyers cost money. Money Mrs. Bennett doesn't have." Winters took the papers back, with deliberate slowness. "Point is, she's got responsibilities. Responsibilities that don't include playing house with strange men." The insult hung in the air like gun smoke, and Sadie saw Rhett's hands clench into fists. For a moment, she thought violence was inevitable, but then Rhett seemed to master himself, his voice remaining level. "I think you've said your piece, Winters. Time for you to leave." "Oh, I'll leave. But Mrs. Bennett's coming with me. Boss wants to have a conversation about her priorities." "No." The word was spoken quietly, but it carried absolute finality. "She's not going anywhere. She doesn't want to go. You planning to stop me?" "If necessary." The 2 men faced each other across the threshold, and Sadie could feel the violence crackling between them like lightning before a storm. She knew she should speak up, should try to diffuse the situation, but fear held her frozen. It was Winters who backed down first, his smile never wavering but something dangerous flickering in his eyes. "This ain't over, Morgan. Mrs. Bennett's got debts to pay, and she will pay them, one way or another." As the 3 men rode away, Sadie sagged against the doorframe, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. The confrontation had taken more out of her than she'd realized, and she felt the baby stirring restlessly in response to her distress. "Are you all right?" Rhett was beside her instantly, his arms supporting her as he guided her to a chair. "I think so, just shaken." She looked up at him, seeing the grim determination in his face. "This isn't going to end well, is it?" "Probably not." Rhett knelt beside her chair, his hands gentle as he checked her pulse. "But it doesn't have to end the way Winters wants it to either." "What do you mean?" "I mean it's time to stop playing by Polk's rules." Rhett's voice carried a note of steel that reminded her of the military commendation in his pocket. "Those papers he's been waving around, they're forgeries. Good ones, but forgeries all the same." "How can you be sure?" "The ink's too fresh for documents that are supposed to be 3 years old. The paper's wrong too. It's newer stock than what would have been available when your husband supposedly signed them." Rhett stood, pacing to the window, where he could watch the retreating riders. "Question is, what are you willing to do about it?" Sadie was quiet for a long moment, one hand resting on her belly where new life stirred with increasing urgency. The baby would come soon, and when it did, she wanted to be able to offer it something better than a life of servitude built on lies. "What do you suggest?" "First, we get you somewhere safe. The Circle M, where Winters can't pressure you or threaten you into compliance." Rhett turned back to face her, his expression serious. "Then we figure out how to prove those papers are fake and put an end to Polk's scheme once and for all. And if we can't prove it, then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it." Rhett moved to kneel beside her again, taking her hands in his. "But I promise you this, Sadie, whatever happens, you and that baby will be protected. I give you my word." Looking into his eyes, seeing the absolute conviction there, Sadie felt something shift inside her chest. The careful walls she'd built around her heart since Henry's death began to crumble, replaced by something that felt dangerously like love. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll come to the Circle M." "When?" "Tonight. If I wait any longer, I'll lose my nerve." Rhett smiled then, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since Winter's arrival. "Tonight it is. I'll come for you after dark, when the store's closed and Polk's asleep." As he helped her into the wagon for what might be their last trip back to town under the pretense of her employment, Sadie felt a mixture of terror and anticipation that left her breathless. She was about to burn every bridge she had, to stake her future and her child's future on the word of a man she'd known for barely a month. But as the Circle M disappeared behind them and the lights of town grew brighter ahead, she realized that sometimes the greatest risk was in not taking a chance at all. The hidden ledger book lay open on Rhett's kitchen table like an accusation waiting to be heard. Its pages, yellowed with age and brittle from years of secret keeping, contained entries that made Sadie's blood run cold as she read them by lamplight. Mary Kellerman, 400 debt for husband's medical bills. Contract, 3 years service. Rebecca Walsh, 275 debt for father's funeral expenses. Contract, 2 years service. Ellen Cartwright, 500 debt for brother's gambling obligations. Contract, 4 years service. And there, near the bottom of the most recent page, Sadie Bennett, 750 debt for husband's alleged gambling losses. Contract, 5 years service. The discovery had come about by accident. While packing her few belongings by candlelight in preparation for her escape to the Circle M, Sadie had knocked over the loose floorboard near her bed, the same board that had threatened to send her tumbling weeks earlier. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden in a space that must have been carved out specifically for the purpose, she'd found Ezra Polk's true ledger. "This isn't the first time," she whispered, her finger tracing the entries that documented years of systematic exploitation. "Look at these names, these amounts. He's been doing this for years." Rhett studied the ledger with the grim attention of a man reading casualty reports. Each entry represented a woman trapped by manufactured debt, forced into servitude by circumstances beyond her control. Some of these names, I remember hearing about these women. Rebecca Walsh disappeared about 2 years ago. People assumed she'd moved on, maybe gone back east to family. According to this, she worked off her debt and was released with a small payment and references for employment elsewhere. Sadie's voice was bitter. Except there's another entry here, dated just a week after her supposed release. RW, problem resolved permanently. Disposal costs, 15. The implications of those cold words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Rhett's jaw tightened as he absorbed the full scope of what they were looking at. Polk's not just exploiting these women, he said quietly. He's killing them when they become inconvenient. But why, if they've worked off their debts? Because dead women don't talk about forged contracts or illegal working conditions. And dead women don't come back to cause problems for respectable businessmen. Rhett closed the ledger with careful precision, his hands steady despite the rage she could see building in his eyes. This isn't just about money, Sadie. This is about a man who's built his entire business on the backs of desperate women and who's willing to commit murder to protect his reputation. Sadie felt the baby kick strongly, as if responding to her distress, and she pressed her hand to the spot where a tiny foot or elbow pushed against her ribs. "There's more," she said quietly. "Turn to the back pages." Rhett reopened the ledger, flipping to entries from several years earlier. There, in Polk's cramped handwriting, was a record that made everything suddenly, horribly clear. Henry Bennett, well poisoning successful. Sickness took hold exactly as planned. Wife now vulnerable for recruitment. Cost of materials. 3. The words swam before Sadie's eyes as the full weight of the revelation crashed over her. Henry hadn't died from natural causes brought on by the spring floods. He'd been murdered poisoned deliberately to leave her vulnerable and desperate, easy prey for Polk's predatory scheme. "He killed my husband," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Henry died because Polk wanted me helpless and alone." Rhett was beside her in an instant, his arms supporting her as grief and rage warred in her chest. The man she'd loved, the gentle dreamer who'd brought her to Kansas in search of a better life, had been murdered for no other reason than to make her useful to a monster's twisted business model. "I'm going to kill him," she said suddenly, her voice deadly calm. "I'm going to take Henry's hunting rifle and put a bullet through Ezra Polk's black heart." "No, you're not." Rhett's voice was gentle but firm. "Because that's not who you are, and it's not what Henry would want for you or the baby." "But he murdered." "I know what he did, and he'll pay for it, I promise you that. But not by turning you into a killer." Rhett cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "There's a better way to handle this. A way that ensures justice without destroying your soul in the process." "What way?" Before Rhett could answer, the sound of approaching horses reached them through the open window. Multiple riders, moving fast and with purpose. Rhett was instantly alert, his body tensing with the instincts that had kept him alive through too many battles. "They're coming for you," he said grimly. "Polk must have discovered you're missing." "What do we do?" "We fight. But first, we make sure that Ledger survives to tell its story." Rhett wrapped the book carefully in its oilcloth covering and pressed it into her hands. "Hide this somewhere safe. No matter what happens to us, that evidence needs to reach the authorities." The pounding on the door came moments later, accompanied by Jake Winter's voice raised in mock authority. "Morgan, open up. We know Mrs. Bennett's in there, and we're here to collect her for her lawful obligations." Rhett checked his rifle and moved toward the window, peering through the curtains at the men assembled outside. "5 of them," he reported quietly. "Winters and 4 others I don't recognize. All armed. Is there another way out?" "Back door leads to the barn. If you can make it there, you could take one of the horses and ride for town. Find the sheriff, show him that ledger." "What about you?" "I'll buy you time." Rhett's smile was grim but determined. "It's what I'm good at." "No," Sadie's voice was fierce with sudden determination. "I'm not running anymore, and I'm not letting you face this alone." Before he could protest, she was moving toward the kitchen, where Henry's old hunting rifle hung above the back door. Her hands were steady as she checked the weapon, muscle memory from countless hunting trips with her husband guiding her movements. "Sadie, my husband is dead because of that man out there," she said quietly. "Other women are dead because of him. I won't let it continue." The pounding on the door intensified, accompanied now by threats and curses that made it clear Winter's patience was wearing thin. But it was the sound of splintering wood that galvanized them both into action, the back door giving way under the assault of men who decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. "Mrs. Bennett," a voice she didn't recognize, called from the kitchen. "Come out peaceful, and nobody needs to get hurt." "Too late for that," Rhett muttered, taking aim at the doorway where shadows moved in the lamplight. "They started this fight when they decided murder was good business." The first man through the door was a stranger, young, nervous, clearly not expecting to face armed resistance. Rhett's shot took him high in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the kitchen table with a cry of pain and surprise. "There's more coming," Sadie warned, her own rifle trained on the doorway. "I can hear them in the yard." "Then we make our stand here." Rhett's voice carried the calm authority of a man who'd been in similar situations before. "Keep low, watch your ammunition, and remember they need you alive. That gives us an advantage." The battle that followed was brief but vicious. Winter's men had expected to find a helpless woman and an aging cowpoke, not two determined fighters with good positions and nothing left to lose. By the time the shooting stopped, two of the attackers were down, and the others had retreated to reconsider their approach. "Morgan," Winter's voice carried across the yard, edged with frustration and rage. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Mrs. Bennett belongs to Mr. Polk until her debts are paid." "Mrs. Bennett doesn't belong to anyone," Rhett called back. "And her debts are fraudulent. We've got proof." A long silence followed, and Sadie could almost hear the wheels turning in Winter's head as he processed this unexpected development. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new note of calculation. "What kind of proof?" "The kind that shows Polk's been forging debt papers and murdering women for years." Sadie's voice rang out clearly, strengthened by righteous anger. "Including my husband. We know what you've been doing, and we're going to make sure everyone else knows, too." Another silence, this one longer and more ominous. When Winters spoke again, all pretense of legality had dropped from his voice. "Well then," he said quietly, "I guess we'll just have to make sure nobody's left to tell that story." The words chilled Sadie to the bone, because they confirmed what she'd already begun to suspect. This was no longer about debt collection or legal obligations. This was about silencing witnesses to a conspiracy that reached deeper than she'd imagined. "Rhett," she said quietly, "I think we're in more trouble than we realized." "I know," his voice was grim but steady, "but we've got something Polk doesn't expect us to have." "What's that?" "Each other." He reached over to squeeze her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "And the truth, sometimes that's enough." Outside, she could hear Winters organizing his remaining men for another assault, his voice carrying the professional efficiency of someone who'd done this before. How many other women had died in similar circumstances, their murders disguised as disappearances or accidents? But this time would be different. This time, there were witnesses who wouldn't go quietly. This time, the truth would survive, no matter what it cost them. Sadie checked her rifle once more and settled into position beside the man who'd become her partner in more ways than one. Whatever happened in the next few hours, they would face it together. And somehow, that made all the difference. The storm came with the darkness, rolling across the Kansas prairie like divine judgment, made manifest in wind and thunder. Lightning split the sky in jagged silver scars, while rain hammered against the windows of the Circle M ranch house, where two desperate people prepared for what might be their final stand. Sadie sat in the sturdy oak chair Rhett had positioned for her in the front room, Henry's hunting rifle across her knees and the storm lantern casting dancing shadows on the walls around them. The baby had been restless all evening, stirring and kicking as if sensing the tension that filled the air like electricity before lightning strikes. "They're waiting for something," Rhett observed, peering through the rain, lashed window at the darkness beyond. "Been nearly 2 hours since the last exchange of gunfire, but I can feel them out there. Maybe they're hoping we'll make a mistake, try to run for it in the storm." "Maybe," Rhett checked his rifle for the dozenth time, his movements automatic and precise. Or maybe they're waiting for reinforcements. Winters struck me as the type who doesn't like leaving witnesses, but he's also careful. Professional. The word professional hung between them with ominous weight. They'd both realized during the long, tense evening that Jake Winters was more than just Polk's hired muscle. The way he'd organized his men, the tactical patience he'd shown after the initial assault failed, it all pointed to someone with military or law enforcement experience. "Do you think the sheriff will come looking when I don't return to town?" Sadie asked, though she already knew the answer. Sheriff Hawkins was a decent enough man, but he was also practical. A pregnant woman who'd gone missing in a storm, possibly run off with a drifterit, wouldn't rate high on his list of priorities until morning at the earliest. Probably not tonight. Rhett's honesty was both brutal and comforting, which means we're on our own until daylight. Another contraction gripped Sadie's belly, stronger than the practice pains she'd been experiencing for weeks. She breathed through it slowly, one hand gripping the rifle while the other pressed against her side. The baby was coming, perhaps not tonight, but soon, very soon. "How often?" Rhett asked, noticing her careful breathing. "Every 20 minutes or so. Dr. Henley said first babies usually take their time, but..." She managed a weak smile. "This child seems determined to pick the worst possible moment to make an appearance." "Babies have their own sense of timing," Rhett replied, though his voice carried a note of concern. The last thing they needed was for Sadie to go into full labor while under siege. "We'll manage whatever comes." A flash of lightning illuminated the yard, and in that brief moment of stark clarity, Rhett caught sight of movement near the barn. "They're repositioning," he said quietly. "Looks like they're trying to get behind us." Sadie shifted in her chair, trying to find a position that eased the pressure in her back. "How many do you think are left?" "Hard to say. We wounded 2 in the first exchange, but I don't know how badly." Rhett moved to the back window, checking the approaches to the house with the methodical attention of someone who'd learned that carelessness was often fatal. "Could be 3, could be 5. Winters is definitely still out there. I'd recognize his voice anywhere." The wind howled around the house like a living thing, rattling the shutters and sending rain through every gap in the weathered wood. Inside, the storm lantern flickered, casting wild shadows that made every corner seem to hide potential threats. "Tell me about the war," Sadie said suddenly, needing something to distract her from both the pain building in her belly and the danger lurking outside. "What was it like, commanding men in battle?" Rhett was quiet for a moment, his eyes still fixed on the storm-torn darkness. "Terrifying," he said finally. "Every decision you make, every order you give, lives hang in the balance. You learn to think fast, plan for the worst, and hope that courage can substitute for luck when everything goes wrong. Is that what we're doing now? Substituting courage for luck?" "Something like that." He turned from the window to look at her, and in the lantern light she could see both the hardened soldier and the gentleman who'd carved Bible verses into cedar wood. "But we've got advantages they don't know about." "Such as?" "They think they're dealing with a helpless woman and an aging rancher. They don't know about your rifle skills or my military training. And they definitely don't know about this." He patted his shirt pocket, where he'd tucked a folded paper. "Letter I wrote earlier, addressed to the territorial marshal. Details everything we found in that ledger, along with our suspicions about what really happened to those missing women." "When did you write that?" "While you were resting this afternoon. Call it insurance." Rhett's smile was grim. "If something happens to us, at least there'll be a record of what we discovered." Another contraction gripped Sadie, this one strong enough to make her gasp. The baby was definitely getting more insistent about making its appearance, storm or no storm, siege or no siege. "Rhett," she said when she could speak again, "if this gets worse, if the baby starts coming, you have to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you'll protect the child, whatever it costs, even if it means letting them take me." "That's not going to happen. Promise me." Her voice carried a note of steel that brooked no argument. "This baby is innocent of all this madness. Whatever debt I might truly owe, Whatever mistakes I've made, this child deserves a chance at life." Rhett knelt beside her chair, his weathered hands covering hers where they gripped the rifle. "I promise you that child will be protected, but I also promise you that we're all going to survive this night. All three of us." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've been in worse situations than this and lived to tell about it. Because you're stronger than you know. And because sometimes the good guys really do win, especially when they're fighting for something that matters." A new sound cut through the storm, the creak of wooden boards under careful footsteps. Someone was on the porch, trying to approach the front door without being detected. Rhett was on his feet instantly, rifle ready, positioning himself where he could cover both the front door and Sadie's chair. "Mrs. Bennett?" The voice that called through the storm was different from Winter's younger, less confident. "My name's Deputy Marshal Tom Bradley. I'm here to help." Rhett's eyes narrowed. A marshal, arriving in the middle of a prairie storm. It was possibilitorial marshals were known for their dedication to duty, but it was also exactly the kind of ruse Winters might use to get them to lower their guard. "Prove it," Rhett called back. "What brings a marshal out in weather like this?" "Got word there might be trouble involving forged documents and threats against a pregnant woman. Been riding since morning to get here." The explanation was plausible, but Rhett had learned long ago that plausible and true weren't always the same thing. "If you're really a marshal, you'll understand why I need more proof than just your word." "Fair enough," the voice called back. "I'm going to slide my badge and commission under the door. You can verify them by the lantern light." A moment later, a leather wallet appeared beneath the door, pushed through the gap by careful fingers. Rhett approached cautiously, never taking his eyes off the door itself, and retrieved the wallet with the toe of his boot. Inside was a federal marshal's badge and a commission document that looked authentic in the flickering lamplight. But authentication was exactly what Winters would be good at, especially if he had the connections Rhett suspected. "Badge looks real," he told Sadie quietly, "but that doesn't mean the man carrying it is who he claims to be." "What do we do?" "We test him," Rhett raised his voice. "Marshal Bradley, if you're really here to help, you'll know about the situation we discovered tonight. Tell me what you know about Ezra Polk's business practices." A pause, long enough for someone to consider their words carefully. Then, "No, he's been running a scheme involving forged debt documents and forced labor contracts. Been investigating him for months, but we needed solid evidence. Word reached us that someone had finally found proof." That stopped Rhett cold. The only way a marshal could know those details was if they were legitimate here, if they were part of the conspiracy from the beginning. "How did word reach you?" he called. "Telegraph message from Sheriff Hawkins in town. Said a woman named Bennett had gone missing, and there were concerns about her safety. When we put that together with our ongoing investigation of Polk, figured it was worth a midnight ride through a storm." Sadie looked at Rhett, hope and uncertainty warring in her expression. Could it be real? Could help actually have arrived? Maybe. But Rhett's military instincts were screaming warnings. Something about the timing felt wrong, too convenient. Or maybe Winters is better connected than we thought. Another contraction hit Sadie, this one strong enough to make her cry out. The baby was definitely coming, and soon. They were running out of time to make decisions, running out of options that didn't involve terrible risks. "Marshal Bradley," Rhett called out. "I'm going to open the door, but I'll be armed and ready. Any sudden movements, and I'll assume you're hostile." "Understood. I'll keep my hands visible." Rhett positioned himself beside the door, rifle ready, and slowly lifted the bar. The door swung inward, revealing a figure silhouetted against the storm-toll, wearing a rain-soaked coat, hands raised and empty. But it was the eyes that gave him away. Even in the dim light, Rhett recognized the cold calculation he'd seen before, the predatory assessment of a man who made his living through violence. Jake Winters had come calling, wearing a dead marshal's badge and hoping desperation would make them careless. "Hello, Morgan," Winters said, his facade dropping away like a discarded mask. "Time to end this charade." Behind him, more figures emerged from the storm, and Rhett realized with sick certainty that their worst fears had just become reality. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and about to face the final confrontation with nowhere left to run. But as another contraction gripped Sadie and she struggled to maintain her grip on Henry's rifle, Rhett felt something shift inside him. The guilt and self-doubt that had haunted him since Mary's death burned away, replaced by a cold, pure determination that had once made him the most feared officer in his regiment. They wanted a fight, he'd give them one they'd never forget. The storm lantern flickered in the wind, casting dancing shadows as two forces prepared for a battle that would determine whether justice or corruption would claim the night. The Colt .45 felt familiar in Rhett's hand as he faced down Jake Winters and his men in the storm-lashed doorway. It was the same weapon that had seen him through 3 years of war, the weight of it as comfortable as a handshake from an old friend. Tonight, it would speak for him one final time. "Smart of you to figure out the badge was stolen," Winters said, rain streaming from his hat brim as he stepped into the house. "Poor Marshal Bradley won't be needing it anymore, seeing as how he had an unfortunate accident on the trail south of town." Behind him, 4 men spread out through the front room with professional efficiency. Rhett recognized the tactical formation. These weren't simple hired guns. They moved like soldiers, like men who'd fought in organized units and understood the value of coordinated assault. "Let me guess," Rhett said, keeping his voice level despite the rage building in his chest. "You're not just Polk's muscle, you're part of something bigger." "Much bigger." Winter's smile was cold as December wind. "Ezra Polk's operation is just one link in a very profitable chain. Territorial expansion creates opportunities for men with vision, men who understand that law and order are flexible concepts when there's money to be made." Sadie gasped as another contraction hit, stronger than before, and Rhett saw Winter's eyes flick toward her with predatory interest. The man was calculating, weighing his options, deciding how best to use her condition to his advantage. "The baby's coming," one of Winter's men observed. "Might be we should wait. Let nature take its course. Dead women can't cause trouble, but neither can women who die in childbirth." "No," Winter's voice carried absolute authority. "Mrs. Bennett knows too much, and so does Morgan. We clean this up tonight, storm or no storm." Rhett's military training kicked in, his mind automatically assessing angles of fire, cover positions, and the tactical disadvantages of being outnumbered 5 to 1 in an enclosed space. The odds were bad, but he'd faced worse odds before and lived to tell about it. "Sadie," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off Winters. "When the shooting starts, get behind the kitchen table and stay down. I can fight. I know you can. But that baby needs you alive." His voice carried gentle finality. "Let me do what I'm good at." What happened next unfolded with the terrible clarity that sometimes accompanies moments of absolute decision. Winters reached for his gun with confident speed, certain that age and circumstance had dulled the reflexes of the man standing across from him. He was catastrophically wrong. Rhett's draw was smooth as silk, faster than thought, the product of thousands of hours of practice and 3 years of combat where speed was the difference between living and dying. The Colt bucked in his hand, and Winters spun sideways with a cry of pain and surprise, his own weapon spinning away into the darkness. The room erupted into chaos. Gunfire crashed like thunder while lightning illuminated the violence in stark, frozen moments. Rhett dove behind the heavy wooden couch, bullets splintering the air where he'd been standing, his mind already calculating the reload time of his opponent's weapons. One of Winter's men, young, nervous, clearly not expecting this level of resistance, made the mistake of advancing too quickly. Rhett's second shot took him center mass, the impact lifting him off his feet and sending him crashing into the wall with a wet, final sound. "Behind you!" Sadie's voice cut through the gunfire, and Rhett spun to see another attacker coming through the kitchen doorway. Her rifle cracked from behind the overturned table, and the man staggered, his weapon discharging harmlessly into the ceiling as he fell. "Stay down," Rhett called to her, but he could see in the brief muzzle flashes that she was struggling with more than just fear. The contractions were coming faster now, harder, and her face was pale with pain and effort. Two attackers remained standing, plus Winters, who was cursing fluently as he clutched his wounded shoulder. The odds were still bad, but they were getting better. "You can't win this, Morgan," Winters shouted from behind an overturned chair. "Even if you kill all of us, there'll be others. The operation's too big to stop." "Maybe," Rhett replied, reloading with practiced speed, "but I can sure as hell stop you." The next exchange of gunfire was brief but decisive. One of the remaining attackers tried to flank around through the kitchen, only to walk into Sadie's careful aim. Her shot caught him in the leg, sending him sprawling across the floor with a scream of pain. The last gunman, seeing his companions fall, made a desperate rush toward Rhett's position. It was a brave move, but bravery without tactical sense was often indistinguishable from suicide. Rhett's third shot ended the man's charge permanently. Sudden silence filled the room, broken only by the storm's fury and the harsh breathing of the survivors. Smoke from gunpowder hung in the air like fog, and the acrid smell of cordite mixed with the clean scent of rain blowing through the shattered windows. "It's over, Winters," Rhett said, rising from cover with his weapon trained on the wounded man. "Your friends are dead or dying, and you're bleeding badly enough that you'll join them soon if you don't get help." Winters looked around at the carnage, his face pale, but his eyes still burning with defiant rage. "You think this changes anything? Polk's operation will continue. The network will continue. We've got judges, sheriffs, territorial officials all the way to Washington. You've won a battle, not a war." "Maybe, but sometimes winning one battle is enough." Rhett was moving toward Winters, intending to secure the man's weapons, when Sadie's cry of pain cut through the air like a knife. This wasn't another contraction. This was something final, urgent, unstoppable. "Rhett!" Her voice was strained with effort and fear. "The baby, it's coming now." He turned toward her, and in that moment of divided attention, Winters made his move. The wounded man had been more hurt than dead, and he'd been waiting for exactly this opportunity. His backup gooner, small derringer hidden in his boot, came up with desperate speed. But Sadie saw it too. Despite the pain racking her body, despite the new life demanding to be born, she swung Henry's hunting rifle around, with strength born of pure determination. Her shot and Winters came at almost the same instant, the two reports blending into a single thunderclap that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Winters' bullet went wide, splintering wood inches from Rhett's head. Sadie's shot did not. Jake Winters pitched backward, his eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been respect. "Well," he gasped, blood frothing on his lips. "Didn't see that coming." Then he was still, and the only sounds in the room were the storm outside and Sadie's labored breathing as nature demanded its due. "Rhett," she said, her voice tight with pain and effort, "I think I know the baby's coming right now." He was beside her in an instant, his warrior's training giving way to gentler instincts as he helped her toward the bedroom. Outside, lightning split the sky and thunder rolled across the prairie, but inside the Circle M ranch house, a different kind of miracle was about to unfold. The battle was over, but the real victory was just beginning. The baby's first cry pierced the storm-torn night like a trumpet call announcing victory over darkness itself. In that pure, powerful sound, all the violence and death that had filled the house moments before seemed to dissolve, replaced by something infinitely more important, the declaration of new life, entering a world that had suddenly become full of possibility. Rhett's hands trembled as he held the tiny, squirming infant, this perfect little person who had chosen the most dramatic possible moment to make her entrance. A girl, healthy and strong, with dark hair matted wet against her small head and lungs that clearly worked exactly as they should. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion as he gently cleaned the baby with the soft cloths he'd prepared weeks ago when hope was still a fragile thing. "Perfect, absolutely perfect." Sadie lay exhausted against the pillows, her face pale but radiant with the particular glow that came with accomplishing the impossible. She'd brought new life into the world while gunfire echoed around her, had defended her home and family with courage that would have made seasoned soldiers proud. "Let me see her," she said softly, and Rhett carefully placed the baby in her arms, watching as mother and daughter met for the first time. The moment was profound in its simplicity. After months of fear and uncertainty, after violence that had claimed too many lives, here was something pure and untainted by the darkness that had brought them together. The baby's tiny fist curled around Sadie's finger with instinctive trust, and Rhett felt something shift permanently in his chest. "What will you name her?" he asked. "Hope," Sadie said without hesitation. "Hope Morgan Bennett." The addition of his name to hers made Rhett's breath catch. "Sadie, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." Her eyes met his, clear and certain despite her exhaustion. "This child was born into your protection, under your roof, defended by your courage. If you'll have us, if you'll make this arrangement permanent, then she should carry your name too." The proposal hung in the air between them, weighted with all the history they'd shared and all the future they might build together. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, the thunder growing more distant as the weather system moved on across the endless prairie. "Mrs. Bennett," Rhett said formally, then smiled and corrected himself. "Sadie, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of letting me be a father to this beautiful child, and perhaps if we're blessed to others in the years to come?" "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, to all of it." He leaned down to kiss her then, gently because of her exhaustion, but with all the love and commitment he'd been afraid to voice until this moment. When they broke apart, the baby stirred in her arms, as if blessing their union with her tiny presence. "We should check on the others," Rhett said reluctantly, though he was loath to leave this perfect moment. "Make sure Winters is really dead. See if any of his men are still breathing." "Be careful," Sadie cautioned. "Even wounded men can be dangerous." Rhett retrieved his Colt and moved carefully through the house, checking each fallen man with military thoroughness. Winters was indeed dead, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling where bullet holes let in streams of rain. 2 of his men had died in the initial exchange of gunfire, while the third, the one Sadie had wounded in the leg, was unconscious but breathing. "This one's alive," Rhett called softly. "Might be useful to have someone who can testify about the conspiracy." He bound the wounded man's leg to stop the bleeding, then secured his hands with rope from the barn. When the authorities arrived, they'd have at least one witness to corroborate the evidence in Polk's hidden ledger. Dawn was breaking grey and clean when the sound of approaching riders reached them through the diminishing rain. Rhett tensed momentarily, then relaxed as he recognized the measured pace of official business rather than the urgent gallop of more attackers. Sheriff Hawkins rode up to the house with 3 deputies, their faces grim as they surveyed the carnage visible through the open door. The lawman dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his weapon but not drawing it. "Morgan," he called. "You folks all right in there?" "We're fine, Sheriff." Rhett stepped into the doorway, his rifle held carefully at his side. "Got a wounded prisoner for you, and some evidence you're going to want to see." The next hour passed in a blur of explanations and revelations. Sheriff Hawkins examined Polk's ledger with growing amazement and horror, reading aloud the entries that documented years of systematic exploitation and murder. "Rebecca Walsh," he murmured, shaking his head. "Ellen Cartwright. Mary Kellerman. I remember these women, remember when they disappeared. Never thought to look for a connection. Polk's been running this scheme for years," Rhett explained, "targeting desperate women, creating artificial debts, then working them to death or killing them when they became inconvenient. And Winters, professional killer, by the look of him, probably had connections all the way to the territorial government." Rhett handed over the letter he'd written, outlining their suspicions about the broader conspiracy. "This needs to reach the federal marshals. The operation was bigger than just one town." The wounded prisoner, awake now and clearly in pain, proved more talkative than Rhett had expected. Faced with hanging for his part in multiple murders, he began naming names and revealing connections that made even the experienced sheriff blanch. "Jesus," Hawkins muttered as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Half the territorial administration's going to be in jail before this is over. As the official business concluded and the bodies were removed, Rhett found himself standing on the porch of his ranch house, watching the sun break through the dissipating storm clouds. Inside, Sadie was resting with their daughter. He could already think of Hope as his own child and, for the first time in years, the future stretched ahead, filled with possibility instead of regret. "Morgan," Sheriff Hawkins approached, his expression thoughtful. "This was good work you did here. Dangerous work, but good. Town's going to be grateful when word gets out about what Polk was really doing. Just did what needed doing. Maybe. But not everyone would have risked so much for someone else's fight." The sheriff paused, then extended his hand. "If you ever get tired of ranching, there's a deputy's badge waiting for you in town." Rhett shook the offered hand but smiled at the suggestion. "Thanks, but I think I've had enough of fighting other people's battles. Time to focus on building something, instead of tearing things down." As the sheriff and his men rode away, Rhett stood for a moment longer in the morning sun, listening to the peaceful sounds of his ranch coming to life. Cattle lowing in the distance, birds calling from the cottonwoods along the creek, and from inside the house, the soft sounds of a woman singing to her newborn child. He'd spent years carrying guilt over the people he'd failed to protect, the battles he'd won at too high a cost, the sister whose death had haunted his dreams. But standing here in the aftermath of the storm, surrounded by evidence of their victory over forces that had seemed insurmountable, he felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. Peace, the kind that came not from the absence of conflict, but from the knowledge that some fights were worth winning, no matter the cost. Inside the house, Hope Morgan Bennett stirred in her mother's arms and opened dark eyes that seemed to hold all the promise of tomorrow. The nightmare was over, and the real life, their life together, was just beginning. 6 weeks later, the marriage certificate lay on the kitchen table next to the morning coffee cups, its official seals and formal language, somehow making real what had felt like a dream since that storm-torn night when their world had changed forever. Judge Williams had ridden out from the county seat specifically to perform the ceremony, declaring it the most unusual wedding he'd ever officiated. Bride, still recovering from childbirth, groom with healing bullet wounds, and a 6-week-old baby as the guest of honor. "Mrs. Morgan," Rhett said softly, testing the name as he watched Sadie feed Hope in the chair by the window. Morning light streamed across both of them, painting mother and daughter in shades of gold that made his chest tight with emotions he was still learning to name. "I like the sound of that," Sadie replied, smiling as the baby's tiny hand wrapped around her finger. "Though I suppose it will take some getting used to." The Circle M had been transformed in the weeks since the confrontation. What had once been a half-run-down bachelor's quarters now showed the touches of a woman's hand curtains in the windows, flowers from the prairie arranged in mason jars, the smell of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen where Sadie had been experimenting with recipes from her mother's memory. The finished cradle sat beside their bed, its cedar rails gleaming with the care Rhett had lavished on every detail. The carved verse from Psalms had proven prophetic. God had indeed covered them with his feathers, had provided shelter under his wings when the storm threatened to destroy everything they held dear. "Any word from the territorial marshal?" Sadie asked, adjusting Hope's position as the baby finished eating. "Letter came yesterday." Rhett held up the official correspondence, its federal seal intact. "Polk's been arrested along with 14 other men in the conspiracy. Judge Morrison's been suspended pending investigation, and they're looking into connections all the way to Washington." "What about the other women, the ones who disappeared?" Rhett's expression grew somber. "They found Rebecca Walsh's body in an unmarked grave behind Polk's store. Ellen Cartwright, too. Families finally have some closure, at least." He set down the letter, his jaw tight with controlled anger. Bastard had been burying his victims right under everyone's noses. Sadie was quiet for a moment, holding Hope closer as she contemplated the lives that had been lost to one man's greed. At least, their deaths weren't in vain. The evidence they provided, even in death, helped bring down the whole network. "Justice has a long memory sometimes," Rhett agreed, even when it takes years to catch up. The baby stirred in Sadie's arms, making the soft, cooing sounds that had become the soundtrack of their new life. Hope had proven to be a remarkably good-natured child, sleeping well and eating with the healthy appetite of someone determined to make up for her dramatic entrance into the world. "She's getting so big already," Sadie marveled, stroking the dark hair that was beginning to show hints of curl. "Hard to believe it's only been 6 weeks. Time moves differently when you're happy," Rhett observed, moving to stand behind her chair. His hands rested gently on her shoulders, and she leaned back against his solid warmth. "I'd almost forgotten what that felt like." They stood that way for a long moment, 3 generations of healing taking shape in the quiet morning light. Outside the window, the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon, but it no longer seemed empty or threatening. Instead, it represented possibility land to be worked, crops to be planted, a future to be built, one careful decision at a time. "Do you ever regret it?" Sadie asked suddenly. "Taking on a widow with a baby, all the complications that came with us." "Every day," Rhett replied, and when she stiffened in surprise, he chuckled softly. "I regret not finding you sooner. I regret that you had to suffer through Polk's scheme at all. I regret that it took violence to bring us together." He leaned down to kiss the top of her head. "But I don't regret a single moment since that first day I saw you in his store. Even the gunfight. Especially the gunfight." His voice carried grim satisfaction. "Some evils need to be stopped, no matter the cost, and some people are worth fighting for." Hope chose that moment to open her eyes, focusing on Rhett's face with the serious attention that babies seem to reserve for important matters. He reached down to touch her tiny hand, marveling again at the perfect miniature fingers and the strength of her grip when she grasped his thumb. "You know what I see when I look at her?" he said quietly. "What?" "Redemption. A chance to do right by someone who matters, to build something good instead of just tearing down what's broken." He met Sadie's eyes, seeing his own wonder reflected there. "I spent so many years carrying guilt over the people I couldn't save. But maybe that was all preparation for this, for being the man you and Hope needed when it mattered most." Sadie turned in her chair to face him fully, the baby cradled securely in her arms. "Do you want to hold her?" It was a question he never tired of hearing, an invitation to share in the miracle they'd created together, not just Hope herself, but the family they'd built from desperation and danger, love and determination. He took the baby carefully, still amazed by how light she was, how perfect. Hope settled against his chest, with the complete trust that children reserved for those they recognized as safe, her tiny fist curling against his shirt. "Hello, little one," he murmured, his voice soft with wonder. "Ready for another day in paradise?" As if in answer, Hope made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been the simple contentment of a child who knew she was loved and protected. Outside, the morning breeze carried the scent of growing thingswheat and corn and wildflowers, the smell of a land coming alive with promise. The Circle M was prospering under their joint care. Rhett's military precision combined with Sadie's practical domestic skills had transformed the ranch into something approaching prosperity. They'd added chickens and expanded the garden, purchased better breeding stock, and improved the irrigation from the creek. But more than that, they'd created something neither had possessed before, a home in the truest sense, a place where love lived in the details. In the way Sadie's sewing box sat beside Rhett's gun-cleaning kit on the kitchen table. In the children's books he'd ordered from the catalogue, already planning for Hope's education. In the second bedroom they'd begun preparing, hopeful that Hope might someday have brothers and sisters to share her childhood. "What are you thinking about?" Sadie asked, noticing the distant look in his eyes. "The future," he said simply. "All the good things we're going to build together." She smiled, the expression transforming her face with radiant happiness. "Tell me." "Well," Rhett settled into his chair, Hope comfortable in his arms. "I was thinking we might plant an orchard next spring. Apple trees, maybe some pears. Take a few years to mature, but by the time Hope's old enough to climb them, we'll have fresh fruit for pies and canning." "That sounds wonderful. And I want to build a proper schoolhouse, Maybe get a teacher to come out from town a few days a week. Make sure Hope and any other children in the area get a real education, not just whatever they can pick up on their own. Any other children? Rhett's smile was gentle but pointed. Well, I was hoping Hope might not be an only child forever, if her mother's agreeable to the idea. Sadie blushed, but her eyes danced with mischief. I think her mother might be very agreeable to that idea. Eventually. They talked through the morning, planning improvements to the ranch and dreams for their growing family. The conversation was punctuated by Hope's needs feeding, changing, the simple pleasure of watching her sleep in perfect security. As noon approached, Rhett reluctantly prepared to ride out to check the cattle in the far pasture. It was routine work, but necessary, and he'd learned not to take anything for granted when it came to protecting what mattered most. I'll be back before supper, he promised, kissing Sadie goodbye with the tender care of a man who'd learned how precious such moments could be. We'll be here, she replied, and the simple promise carried the weight of forever. As Rhett rode out across the prairie, Hope sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, the Circle M settled into the quiet rhythms of afternoon. Inside the house, Sadie hummed softly as she worked, the melody drifting through the windows to mix with birdsong and the distant sound of cattle. The storm that had brought them together was long past, leaving only clear skies and the endless promise of tomorrow. In a hard land where survival was never guaranteed, they'd found something more precious than gold or easy fortune. They'd found each other, and in finding each other, they'd discovered that love, once kindled by pure mercy, could indeed blaze fierce enough to outshine any darkness the frontier could throw. The marriage certificate on the kitchen table bore witness to their union, but the real testament to their love lay in smaller things, in the way Rhett's weathered hands had learned to be gentle with baby clothes, in the way Sadie's eyes lit up when she heard his horse returning from the fields, in the way Hope's tiny fist curled around his finger each night as he read to her from the Bible that had once belonged to another good man. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the Kansas prairie, 3 hearts beat in harmony under the roof of the Circle M ranch house. A widow had found hope she never thought possible. A lonely cowboy had discovered that redemption came not from forgetting the past, but from using its lessons to build something better. And a child had been born into a world where love was stronger than fear, where mercy could triumph over greed, and where even the hardest storms eventually gave way to morning. In the distance, meadowlarks called from the grassland, their song carrying across the vast spaces where other families were building their own dreams, one careful day at a time. The frontier was still hard, still unforgiving to the weak or unprepared, but for those with courage enough to face it together, it offered something no civilized place could match: the chance to start over, to write their own ending, to prove that sometimes the greatest victories came not from conquering enemies, but from choosing to love, in spite of everything that tried to make such choices impossible. And in the quiet contentment of the Circle M, where a cedar cradle held promises carved in wood and a family forged in fire settled into the rhythms of forever, that proof lived on.